You're telling me you won't serve him? The supervisor's voice was incredulous, almost a little laughable, like she couldn't understand how Ava, someone who had always been so calm, could be so adamant about something like this. But Ava's eyes were steely. She stood firm at the front of the plane, just a few feet away from the door that led into the cabin, the weight of her decision like a 1,000-pound anchor, and yet she couldn't move. Ava looked at the woman, her supervisor, for a beat longer than necessary. She could feel the tension coiling up her spine. The aircraft was ready to take off in just a few minutes, and here she was, standing in a tug-of-war over a decision that felt like it had more weight than a simple job duty. "I'm not serving him," she said again, her voice low, but steady, unwavering. The words felt right, like she was doing something important, even if she couldn't quite put into words why she felt that way. "I can't." Her supervisor, who had been scanning through her tablet, stopped, finally glancing up with wide eyes. "Ava, this is ridiculous. It's Donald Trump. He's one of the most important people on this flight, and you're telling me you're refusing to board him?" She couldn't hide the disbelief in her voice, her hand twitching toward her earpiece as though waiting for someone to give her instructions. It was a command, a reflex to push for compliance no matter what. But Ava stood still, shaking her head, as if she could push the entire situation away with that simple motion. "I know who he is," Ava replied quietly, feeling her palms sweat, a sudden rush of adrenaline coursing through her. She wasn't sure what she was more afraid of, her own decision, or the way she felt as if the room had gotten smaller, the air thinner. "I know exactly who he is." Her chest tightened as the words left her mouth, and she found herself standing a little straighter, bracing herself. She hadn't spoken about her political beliefs at work, not really, not in a way that mattered. But now she couldn't stop herself from saying it. "I just can't be around him. I won't serve him. I won't pretend it's okay." Her supervisor was quiet for a moment, as though evaluating her, trying to figure out if she was bluffing. "Ava, you know what's at stake here, don't you?" She leaned in a little, her voice softer, the tension between them palpable now, thick like smoke. "You're choosing a personal issue over your job, over your paycheck. You want to throw everything away for her, for a man who has spent his career tearing people down?" Ava interrupted before she could finish. The words came out sharper than she intended, a reflection of everything she'd been holding back for so long. For a man who divides people like he's got a monopoly on hatred? Her eyes were now locked onto her supervisors, and something inside her clicked. This wasn't just about Trump. It wasn't just about politics. This was about standing up for what she believed in, even if no one around her seemed to care. Even if it cost her everything. Ava could feel the weight of the decision now, pressing against her ribs, but there was no way back. Not anymore. Her supervisor's expression hardened, a flicker of frustration crossing her face before she leaned forward. "Fine. If that's your choice, then you know what happens next," she said, turning on her heel, the finality in her tone sending a chill down Ava's spine. The supervisor was gone in seconds, walking off to the cockpit, presumably to make the call. Ava stood there, not sure what she was feeling now. Fear? Courage? Maybe a bit of both. Her stomach twisted, the pit of anxiety growing deeper, but she couldn't back down. She knew, deep down, she couldn't back down. As she glanced back down the aisle to the man who had become the symbol of everything she couldn't stand, she realized that her world, the safe little bubble she'd built around herself, was no longer hers to control. Not today. Not when this was the choice she'd made. A few minutes later, she would be fired. Ava didn't have time to process what had just happened before her supervisor came back with a team of managers and a security guard in tow. The crew had all gathered by the galley, their voices hushed but rising in tension, the sounds of the terminal fading into a distant hum as if everything around them was losing focus. Ava stood there, eyes locked on the entrance to the cockpit, trying to slow her breath, trying to steady herself. But the moment she saw the supervisors and the guard walking toward her, she knew. She knew exactly what was coming. "Ava," one of the managers said in a voice that was too calm for the situation. His face, however, was not calm. There was a thin line of sweat at his temples, and his suit jacket was hanging too loosely around his shoulders, like he'd rushed to put it on. "You need to come with us," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even an order. It was a statement of inevitability. She didn't move immediately. The words she wanted to say, the things she wished she could scream, were stuck somewhere deep inside of her. Instead, Ava nodded slowly, as if she was agreeing to the terms of a contract she'd already signed without even realizing it. The managers didn't waste time waiting for her to respond. The taller of the two moved in closer, his hands slightly raised as if trying to guide her away from the cabin like some kind of trapped animal. She looked at him, hard, and he hesitated, but then it was as though the dam had broken. The security guard stepped forward and said in a voice that was meant to be soft but came out too harsh, "Come on, Ava, let's not make this more difficult." Her eyes shifted to him, then to the supervisor, and finally, back to the ground, her heart thundering in her chest. She could feel the burning shame creeping up her neck, but there was something else, something raw that was growing louder in her mind. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't even fear. It was something sharper, something deeper, clarity. Ava was done apologizing for who she was. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the thick tension. The guard stopped mid-step, his gaze flicking up to hers in surprise, as if he didn't expect her to speak, let alone say something so direct. She swallowed hard and stood up straighter. "Before you fire me, before you throw me off this plane, I just need to ask you something," she said, the words coming out more confident than she'd thought they would. "When you work for someone like Trump, someone who," she paused, briefly catching herself, before pushing forward, "who uses his power to hurt people, who doesn't care who he steps on to get what he wants, how do you live with that? How do you keep your hands clean, knowing you're just a pawn in the game of someone who has no respect for others?" Her words spilled out in a rush, like they were all the things she'd kept buried deep inside for so long. The supervisor raised her hand, cutting Ava off before she could go on. "Ava," she said, voice tight, clearly on edge. "This isn't about politics. This is about your job. We've all made a decision, and you have to accept it. You can't." "No," Ava interrupted, shaking her head slowly as the words hung in the air. "You don't get it. This is about politics. It's about who I am. I can't just pretend like it doesn't matter." She stepped back, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her breath quickening. "I can't serve a man who openly mocks people, who targets minorities, who doesn't give a damn about anyone but himself. I can't. I can't be part of it. If that costs me my job, then fine. But I won't do it." The silence that followed was heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for someone else to say something. The managers exchanged looks, their faces blank, but there was something beneath the surface that Ava couldn't quite read. Disappointment, perhaps? Or maybe it was just the pressure of the situation weighing on them too. The security guard stepped forward and raised a hand, but he hesitated, unsure of what to do. "Ava, this is a bad time for you to be making a stand. You know this is going to cost you. You're going to lose everything over this. Over one person." "It's not over one person," Ava said, cutting him off again. Her heart was racing, but the fury inside her was starting to settle, replaced with something quieter, stronger. "It's not about just one man. It's about all the people who think it's okay to support someone like that. It's about all the people who don't care about anything but their own power. This is the moment I get to decide who I am, and I'm not going to back down just because it's uncomfortable for you. Or for anyone else." She could feel the walls closing in, but she refused to let the panic take over. Her voice was steady now, her body taut but not trembling. "I refuse to be part of that system. I'm done." The supervisor looked at her, eyes narrowing as she crossed her arms, clearly irritated. "You're making a huge mistake," she said. Her tone was clipped, almost condescending, but there was something else there, something that Ava couldn't quite place. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was the realization that Ava wasn't backing down. "Not this time." "Maybe I am," Ava said, taking a deep breath. "But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror when it's over." For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of the plane's engines outside. Then the supervisor turned and signaled for the security guard to escort Ava out of the aircraft. As they walked toward the exit, Ava caught one last glimpse of the man who had sparked all of this. Donald Trump was still sitting there, his entourage chatting around him, completely oblivious to the storm that had just unfolded around them. She had no idea what would come next, or what her future would look like. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She was no longer part of the system she despised. She had walked away from it, and no matter what happened next, no one could take that from her. They reached the door, and as the security guard gestured for her to step off the plane, Ava felt her chest tighten one last time. But then she exhaled slowly, her heart thumping with the simple truth. She had made the right choice. The doors of the airplane shut behind her with a finality that made Ava's heart drop. She stood on the tarmac, the chilly air biting at her skin, feeling the weight of what had just happened hit her like a ton of bricks. The security guard had walked off, his job done, but Ava didn't move. She stood there for a long moment, watching the plane, the one she'd just been kicked off of, as it began to taxi down the runway. Her mind was still reeling, the sounds of the airport too distant for her to process, her hands shaking at her sides. The anger that had burned so brightly inside her was now replaced with a cold exhaustion, a kind of numbness that was both liberating and suffocating. It felt like the world was going on without her, and she was just standing still, watching it pass by. She didn't even know what to feel anymore. There was no victory in what she'd done, no satisfaction, no moment of triumph. She had made her decision, sure, but at what cost? She didn't have the answers, and that uncertainty was eating at her. Ava. The voice broke through her thoughts, sharp, yet familiar. She turned slowly, her heart skipping when she saw her colleague, Emma, jogging toward her. Emma was a friend. She wasn't her closest friend, but they had worked together for years, shared quiet moments in the break room, commiserated over tough flights. Ava hadn't expected to see her here, and she certainly didn't expect the look on Emma's face. It wasn't pity, exactly. It was more concern. "What are you doing here?" Ava asked, her voice hoarse, trying to keep it steady. Emma slowed as she reached Ava, standing just a few feet away. Her eyes were wide, as if she had just witnessed something she couldn't believe. You're really going through with this, huh?" she asked, her voice quiet, unsure, like she was walking on glass. "You just let them fire you?" Ava took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her body felt like it was full of holes. She was so tired, too tired to keep pretending she had it all together. "I didn't let them do anything. I made my choice," she said, her voice cracking a little, not caring if Emma heard it. "I wasn't going to serve him. I couldn't. Not after everything he's done. Not after everything he stands for." She paused, and her eyes flickered to the runway again, watching the plane that had just taken off. She could feel the ache in her chest, the weight of her decision pressing on her lungs. "I didn't think it would feel like this, though." Emma was silent for a moment, taking in Ava's words. Her expression softened, but the concern didn't fade. She stepped closer, her face a little too close for comfort, but Ava didn't mind. They weren't strangers. They had spent enough late-night shifts together to know what each other needed without saying much. "You sure you're okay?" Emma asked, her voice low. "I don't know, Ava. I don't know if this is the right way to do this. You've got to know this is going to blow up, right? You're going to be all over the news. This might not just be a job. You might." Ava cut her off, her frustration bubbling to the surface again, sharp as glass. "I don't care about the news," she said, her voice louder than she intended. "I don't care about any of it. I made the right choice, and if it costs me my job, if it costs me my future, then that's what it costs. But at least I won't feel like a hypocrite every time I walk into work. At least I'll be able to say that I did something right for once." Emma's eyes narrowed, studying her for a moment. "You sure this is all you've got?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but still full of concern. "Because, it's not going to be easy. You think everyone will see this the way you do? You think they'll just go good for you when they read about it?" Emma shook her head. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be ugly. People are going to hate you for this. For standing up like this. I mean, Trump." "Yeah, I know who Trump is," Ava snapped, cutting her off once again. "I've been dealing with him for years, but I don't care about his supporters. I'm not trying to be a hero here, Emma. I'm just trying to be someone who can look at themselves in the mirror at the end of the day." There was a long silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. Emma looked at her, eyes full of something Ava couldn't quite place. Respect, maybe? Or maybe disbelief, maybe even fear. "You sure you're ready for what's coming?" she asked quietly, almost as if she were asking herself the same question. "Because once this gets out, there's no turning back. They're not going to let you get away with this." Ava exhaled slowly, the anger and frustration in her chest giving way to something heavier. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what was coming. She didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she'd ever get her job back, or if the backlash would be more than she could handle. But what she did know was that she couldn't live in a world where she ignored what was happening. She couldn't sit back and pretend that everything was fine, not when it wasn't. "I don't know what's coming next," Ava said, her voice softer now, almost like a whisper. "I really don't. But I do know that I'll be able to walk away from this knowing I did something for the right reasons." She looked Emma in the eyes, finally seeing the woman who had always been there beside her, the person who had spent years in the trenches with her, understanding her frustrations, her joys, and her sacrifices. Emma didn't say anything for a while, but after a long, silent moment, she took a step closer. "I don't know if I could have done it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I mean, I get it. I get why you did it. But I'm not sure I'd be strong enough to do the same. Ava didn't know what to say to that. There was no answer, no comforting words. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a martyr. She was just someone who had made a decision, and she wasn't sure if it was the right one or not. She couldn't predict the future, but she could live with her own choices. And right now, that was all that mattered. You don't have to, Ava said finally, meeting Emma's eyes. But I did. And that's enough for me. Emma nodded, but the tension in her face never fully left. She didn't argue with Ava, but she didn't fully understand either. She gave her one last look before turning to leave, but as she walked away, Ava couldn't help but feel a sense of finality settling over her. Whatever came next, she had already made her stand, and she was ready to face the consequences. The phone rang early the next morning, the shrill sound cutting through the haze of sleep in a way that made Ava jump. Her hand shot out instinctively to silence it, her heart still thumping from the unsettling dreams of the night before. She didn't even need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. It was exactly the kind of call she had been dreading since she'd walked off the plane. The same call she knew would come, but somehow had convinced herself would never actually happen. She didn't hesitate this time. She didn't need to. Without thinking, her thumb slid across the screen to accept the call. Hello? Ava, it's Andrew. We need to talk. His voice was urgent, but somehow tinged with an underlying sense of calm that Ava didn't trust. Andrew was her supervisor, the person who had always kept a watchful eye on her during her time as a flight attendant. He was the kind of manager who wanted to please everyone but also knew how to play the game when necessary. Ava didn't bother greeting him. She didn't even try to sound polite. What's this about? I already know what you're calling about. I don't need any lectures. Andrew's silence on the other end of the line told her everything. He was weighing his words, considering how to approach her, but Ava wasn't interested in waiting. I'm done, Andrew. You know what I did, and I'm not backing down, she said flatly. You can fire me if you want. You can spread whatever rumors you want, but I won't apologize for what I did. There was a heavy sigh before Andrew responded. Ava, you're making a huge mistake. You don't understand the consequences of what you've done. His tone was softer now, as if he were trying to reason with her. But there was an edge to it, a frustration that hadn't been there before. You think you've made some kind of bold stand, but you're about to lose everything. Your career. Your reputation. You've made it impossible for us to bring you back. Do you really understand what you're doing? Ava stared at the wall, hearing the words but not really listening. She had heard the same sentiment repeated by Emma, by the others. She knew this was coming, and yet, she wasn't moved by it. The weight of the situation wasn't new to her. It wasn't a matter of ignorance. It was about standing firm, about choosing a path and not turning back. I know exactly what I'm doing, Ava said, her voice calm, almost too calm. And I'm not going to regret it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I didn't make the right choice. It's my life. My decision. She paused, taking a deep breath, gathering herself before continuing. If you want me to apologize or say I'm sorry for standing up for what I believe in, then you've got the wrong person. Because I won't. I'm not sorry. Andrew was silent for a moment, and Ava could almost feel his disappointment radiating through the phone. You'll regret this, he finally said, his voice quieter. It's going to follow you. You'll always be known as the flight attendant who turned on her own company for a political statement. That's what they'll say about you. That's how they'll see you from now on. Ava's grip on the phone tightened as her throat tightened, too. She could feel the tears threatening to spill over, but she refused to let them. She wasn't about to break down in the middle of this conversation. Not for Andrew. Not for anyone. Let them say it, she replied, the words coming out sharp, like a clean cut. Let them talk. I'll be fine. I'll figure it out. But at least I'll know that I stayed true to myself. At least I'll be able to sleep at night, knowing that I didn't ignore what was happening in front of me. There was another pause, this time longer than the last. Ava could hear Andrew shifting on the other end, probably sitting in his office, trying to figure out how to handle this conversation. She could almost picture him fidgeting with a pen, tapping his fingers nervously on his desk, the way he always did when he had bad news. I'm sorry it had to come to this, he said finally, his tone resigned. I really am. But I can't bring you back. It's beyond my control now. Corporates made their decision. You're done. Ava let out a long exhale, but there was no relief in it. She knew it was coming, but hearing the words still stung. Fine, she said, her voice breaking for just a moment, though she quickly composed herself. It's done. Thanks for the call. She hung up before Andrew could say anything else. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down, staring at it for a long moment. The finality of it all settled over her like a weight she couldn't lift. There were no words left to say, no more arguments to be made. It was over. The chapter had closed. She sat there in silence, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, the world outside her apartment window continuing as though nothing had changed. But she had changed. She felt it in every bone of her body, in the way her heart beat a little faster, the way her chest tightened with every breath. She had stood her ground. Yes, but it hadn't come without consequences. The doorbell rang just as she was starting to drift into her thoughts. Ava jumped slightly, startled by the sudden interruption. She stood up, a little unsteady on her feet, but she forced herself to move toward the door. When she opened it, she wasn't expecting anyone. But there stood Emma, her face flushed, a half-smile tugging at her lips. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she just looked at Ava for a moment, her expression unreadable, before stepping inside. "You didn't think I was just going to let you handle this alone, did you?" Emma asked, her voice light, but the seriousness underneath was clear. Ava didn't know what to say. She couldn't remember the last time someone had come to her like this, not without being asked, not out of some sense of duty. She didn't know why Emma had come, but somehow, it felt like the right thing. "Thanks for showing up," Ava said quietly, her voice hoarse from the tears she hadn't let fall. "Don't mention it," Emma replied. She took a seat on the couch, kicking off her shoes and sitting back with a sigh. "I'll be here for as long as it takes." Ava smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I guess we'll see what comes next, won't we?" "Yeah," Emma said softly, nodding in agreement. "But whatever happens, you've got this." Ava didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, she just nodded back. Because for the first time in a long time, despite everything that had happened, she felt like maybe she was going to be okay. The next few days blurred into one long stretch of restless nights and overwhelming silence. Ava didn't know how to fill the empty space that seemed to have swallowed her entire life. She had spent years working in the airline industry, building a reputation, earning the respect of her colleagues, gaining the trust of her supervisors. And now? Now, she was back at square one, with nothing but her own thoughts and the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She hadn't heard from anyone at the airline since the call with Andrew, and part of her was almost relieved. The silence felt like a small victory, proof that no one was going to drag her back into a system she couldn't be a part of anymore. But the other part of her, the part that wasn't so sure of what she had done, the part that wondered if she had made a mistake, was starting to ache. Ava had always been someone who liked certainty. She liked knowing where she stood, whether it was with people or with her own choices. But now, she was adrift, with nothing to hold on to but her beliefs. It wasn't enough to fill the void. She found herself scrolling through social media more than she had ever done before. The world was talking about her now. Some people were applauding her for standing up to someone like Donald Trump, calling her brave and principled. Others were calling her names, accusing her of being unprofessional, selfish, and irrational. The comments felt like a constant barrage, each one leaving a scar that Ava couldn't seem to shake. It was exhausting, draining her in ways she hadn't expected. "Why do you keep reading this stuff?" Emma's voice broke through Ava's thoughts, pulling her back into the present moment. She hadn't noticed Emma come into the living room, but there she was, standing in the doorway, her arms crossed as she watched Ava with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "I don't know," Ava muttered, putting the phone down on the coffee table. "I just can't stop myself. It's like I need to know what they're saying. I need to know if I made the right choice." Emma shook her head, stepping into the room and sitting down next to her. "You won't find the answer in those comments, Ava. You're never going to get the closure you're looking for from people who don't understand you. You're never going to get the validation you want from the people who disagree with you. It doesn't work like that." "I thought it would feel different," Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought that once I made the choice, once I stood my ground, I'd feel something. Like I'd know I did the right thing. But I don't feel that. I feel like I made a mistake. Like I ruined my life for nothing." Emma reached over, placing a hand on Ava's shoulder in an attempt to comfort her. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. "Ava, you didn't ruin anything. You stood up for what you believed in. You didn't let the fear of losing your job or your reputation stop you from doing what you felt was right. That's something people don't do enough." Ava looked at Emma, her eyes tired, her face pale from lack of sleep. "It's not enough, though, is it? I'm not going to get my job back. I'm not going to be able to erase what I've done. People are going to remember this. I'm going to be the flight attendant who refused to serve Trump. That's how they'll see me now. And so what?" Emma shot back, her voice firm. So what if they remember you like that? What does it matter? You can't control how people see you, Ava. You can't control what they say about you. What matters is how you see yourself. What matters is that you made a choice, and it wasn't because of fear. It wasn't because someone told you it was the right thing to do. It was because you believed in it. And that's something you should be proud of. Ava let out a long, exhausted breath, her eyes darting to the window as if she were searching for something outside of herself to give her an answer. But there was nothing. The world beyond her apartment window seemed so far away, a place that had nothing to do with the woman sitting in front of Emma. A place that felt increasingly distant with each passing day. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Ava admitted, her voice shaky now. I don't know if I can keep living in this limbo, waiting for the next thing to happen, waiting for someone to call me with a job offer or to offer me a chance to explain myself. Emma's expression softened, and she leaned in a little closer, her eyes meeting Ava's. Maybe you don't need someone to give you permission to move on, she said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. Maybe you need to give yourself permission. This thing with Trump, this whole situation, it's not the end of you. It's just a chapter. You don't have to stay stuck here, in this place where you're questioning everything. You don't have to keep living in the shadow of this one decision. You can move forward. It's going to be hard, but you don't have to let this one thing define you. Ava's gaze shifted downward, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the coffee table. The weight of Emma's words hung in the air, and for the first time in days, Ava felt a tiny flicker of something inside her, a spark, maybe, a spark of hope. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. I don't know where to start, Ava said, her voice quieter now. Emma smiled, a soft, knowing smile. Start by letting go of the idea that you have to fix everything right now. It's okay to take things one step at a time. It's okay to not have everything figured out. Ava nodded slowly, as if the idea was starting to settle into her mind. She didn't have to have it all figured out. She didn't have to know what would come next. She just had to take the next step. I'll help you figure it out, Emma added, her voice steady, offering Ava something that she hadn't even realized she needed. You don't have to do it alone. Ava felt the tightness in her chest begin to loosen, just a little. She still didn't know what would happen, or where her life was going now. But maybe that was okay. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers right away. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, it was enough to just be. Thanks, Emma, Ava said, her voice sincere. She looked at her friend, the person who had shown up when she needed it the most, and for the first time in days, she felt a small sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Anytime, Emma said, smiling. And for the first time in a long while, Ava smiled back.